It is incredibly important for us to think about how New Testament writers used and interpreted the Old Testament, if for no other reason than we want to follow their example. Critics of the Bible will say that New Testament writers showed a total disregard for the historical literary context of those Old Testament passages, that they often twisted the meaning and just applied it in any way they wanted. It seems that those critics feel that the New Testament writers interpreted the Old Testament the way this video says we should learn to interpret dreams.
During our waking hours, our conscious minds are very much in control, but when we sleep, the unconscious mind takes over, and we enter the world of dreams with all its visual imagery, symbols, and use of metaphors. To truly understand and benefit from our dreams, we need to remember and listen with our hearts rather than just our heads. We need to develop our intuitions while suspending certain prejudgments and beliefs. An open mind is the best personal development tool we can have. And remember, there is surely nothing more universal than dreams.
I didn't show you that video because I think you should go out and start interpreting your dreams. I showed it to you as an example of the type of thing modern critics say the New Testament writers did to the Old Testament. They suspended judgment. They didn't pay attention to objective factors like historical context and authorial intent. But that's just not the case. I think that New Testament writers were very concerned with historical context. I would agree with Beale when he says this about the New Testament use of the Old Testament. The New Testament use of the Old Testament passages is significantly influenced by the context of those Old Testament texts, even though there is development of the meaning in the New Testament. So he wants to always keep the New Testament use of a text connected to the original Old Testament context, and I think that is wise. It may not always be transparent how they connect, but if we give it enough thought and if we understand the methodological approaches of these New Testament writers, we begin to see how, yes, this is definitely connected to the idea that was being communicated in that original Old Testament passage. Now, many people like to say that the writers of the New Testament simply followed Judaistic interpretive methods in their handling of the Old Testament. And that is true to a degree because one of the major methods used by first century Jews was the literalistic or normative approach to Old Testament texts. How do we know that? Well, we look at some of the literature that's come out of the first century Mediterranean world. And that literature includes things like the Targums, which were paraphrases of the Hebrew Old Testament into Aramaic. And the Targums were halfway between a straightforward translation and a free kind of telling of the biblical narrative. There's also the Talmudic literature. Probably the best known of that is the Mishnah. And the Mishnah was simply rabbinic tradition on the application of the law given in topical arrangements. Scripture is cited, but there's very little systematic exposition of Scripture. There's also the Dead Sea Scrolls, written by the Qumran Essenes. Though one finds traditional rabbinic type literature in the Dead Sea Scroll collections, the distinctive contribution of the Essenes was their Jewish apocalyptic literature. This was a casting of the theology of God's sovereignty and visions bearing evidence of Greek dualism. And then there's Philo of Alexandria, and he followed an allegorical interpretation. He attempts to use the Old Testament as an allegorical base from which to illustrate Greek philosophy. The goal is to break down the wall between Hebraic thought and Greek thought and worldviews. So by studying these various types of literature, we get an idea of the different ways the Jews handled the scriptures. And what becomes very clear in them is that, first of all, they took a literal approach to the scriptures. Most scholars recognize that literalism was the foundation of Judaistic interpretation. Some say it was a given of Judaistic literature. However, in these documents, we also find a midrashic approach, or midrash, which is simply a commentary. It's interpretation based upon certain established rules of interpretation. Now, some of these rules are valid and some of them are really crazy. The point of departure is always the biblical text, but the job of the interpreter is to explicate the meaning in the text by the application of these hermeneutical rules and thereby make the revelation of God of contemporary value. Now, originally, the 6 basic rules of Midrash were quite sound. The first was Kal Vachomer, which was a form of deductive reasoning, arguing from a premise to a conclusion. The second was Gershara Shwava, which was a argument based on verbal analogy, where similar words or analogous words were connected to find meaning. Binyan ab mitab ehad, building text pools, was a legitimate approach, and this was simply an attempt to gather texts of Scripture together that all had a common subject, like all New Testament or New Covenant promise texts in the Old Testament would form a text pool. Gahal Urat is arguing from the general to the particular, another form of deduction. The Kayuz o Baham Ahar is as in another place. In other words, the analogy of Scripture. And then the last one is Dabar Halmid Miyano, which is context rules. Now, of course, my Hebrew pronunciation is totally wrong, so don't even pay attention to that. But these 6 basic rules of Midrash were valid rules. However, the rules changed over time. More were added. They ended up with 32 rules, and some of them were quite wacky. They involved computation of numeric values of letters. They involved breaking up a word into 2 or more words, exposition of single letters and how that might happen. So it's fair to say that the New Testament writers would have at some points followed Midrash, but when we say that, we have to understand that that's a whole continuum of approaches to the Bible. Some would be very sound, some would not. And I don't think that New Testament writers used those methods or hermeneutical rules that were not sound. Another interpretive approach common in the first century is what we call Pesher interpretation. This was based upon 13 rules of interpretation. 11 of these are very similar to the rules of Midrashic interpretation. However, some were very subjective. The subjective ones, by and large, dealt with finding hidden meaning about the future in the text. Rule number 1, for instance, says everything the ancient prophet wrote has a veiled eschatological meaning. Well, not everything that they wrote had that, but this principle says that's the case. And some people would take a passage like the one in Matthew that says, out of Egypt I have called my son, and say, it's Pesher interpretation. The New Testament writers finding a veiled, hidden eschatological meaning in a passage that has no apparent eschatological meaning when you look at it in its historical context. So Pesher interpretation was given to looking for these veiled, hidden meaning. Where this gets really dangerous is rule number 2. Inner revelation is given to the interpreter to bring out these hidden meanings. So it is a totally subjective form of interpretation. The interpretation is not based on historical context, it's not based on grammatical meaning, it's not based on literary forms or literary devices. It's just an inner revelation given to the interpreter, and in reality that revelation or that interpretation could have nothing whatsoever to do with the meaning of the text. Many people say that this was a favored form of interpretation for New Testament writers because of their identification of messianic types in the Old Testament. The truth is, New Testament writers did not identify a whole lot of types for Christ in the Old Testament. There were places like when Paul identifies Christ as the rock that followed the Israelites through the wilderness, and Paul again identifying Christ as the Passover lamb. But most of the time, the New Testament writers find Christ as the fulfillment of specific messianic prophecy. And this is not Pesher. This is not some insight given to them uniquely. Instead, it's an alignment of the things that are outlined in the prophecy with the actual lived experience of Jesus. Because Pesher is so subjective, we have to be very careful of ascribing it as an interpretive method commonly used by the New Testament writers. So let's go back to Matthew chapter 2, verse 15. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Clearly in Hosea, where the verse appears, Hosea is talking about Israel's historical lived experience, that God loved them and redeemed them from Egypt, and yet they didn't respond with gratitude. Now, when Matthew uses this verse, it's not because he has some inner pesher kind of insight, some inner revelation that God actually always meant this was about Jesus. Rather, Matthew sees there's a pattern here. Jesus is the Israel of God. He is the servant of Yahweh, and he is fulfilling all of the will of God, which God entrusted to Israel. He is doing everything that Israel should have done. And so Matthew now sees here this kind of alignment between the pattern of Israel and the pattern of Christ. It's a metaphorical use of the passage from Hosea, a paradigmatic use of the passage from Hosea. Now, I think that it's safe to say that there's common ground between Judaistic interpreters and the apostles. Not all the principles of interpretation held by the rabbis were in error. Many were simple and filled with common sense. Many were universally acknowledged methods for understanding any text. On these principles, one finds agreement between the rabbis and the New Testament writers' use of the Old Testament. But that still leaves the question of whether or not the apostles used some of the more radical methods that involved interpreting the text and totally changing its meaning. Though the apostles claimed special direction from the Spirit of God, they did not see this special revelatory work as a justification for violating the context and the sense of the original Old Testament meaning. Yet there are a number of passages that seem to do that, and they're difficult to understand. I think for those passages, we need to look at another approach to the New Testament use of the Old, and that is the paradigmatic approach to the Old Testament scriptures. The paradigmatic approach is actually a process whereby writers metaphorize narrative sections of the Old Testament. They see them as providing a metaphor for something in their lived experience. The paradigmatic approach is actually the most pastoral method that is used by New Testament writers in their handling of the Old Testament scriptures. I'm not going to talk you through the paradigmatic approach. Instead, I've written it up for you, and I want you to go into Moodle and to read that article. Take notes on it, and you will need that information when you take the quiz on this next section, so be sure to go from the video now and read that material. Thank you.